Hello everybody, and welcome to week 5 and 6 of our module on action research amongst children at risk in community context. And we have come to the middle of our course and module, and last 2 weeks you have been working on your research problem and theme, and this week we address the question of how to do a critical literature review on the research thematic. Hope you had fun even as you began your pilot research in your research context in order to identify the research problem and theme. So let's do a quick review. The research problem was the one problem that you have chosen out of the many problems that the stakeholders identified in your research context. And also, it was a problem that you were personally invested in, even as you did your reflective thinking about what is important for you. And then you went on to abstract a theme from these narratives of both the stakeholders and your own thinking. And once you abstracted the theme out of the problem, then you did a literature survey on the discourse and discipline of holistic child development in order to identify an academic category or academic terms or phrases that best represented your theme, and we called it the thematic. So now, for me, you have the thematic. I know some of you may not yet have it, so keep working, keep plodding on your research problem and your narrative writing, your abstraction, and I'm sure you will get there. But I have to presuppose for this session that you have your thematic in your hand. And the question now is, what do we do next? So we're going to move from research problem to theme. You've already done it. And from theme to thematic, which you did with the literature survey. And now we're going to try and move to the research question by doing a critical literature review. The problem and the theme that came out of the problem, these can be thematized differently by different intellectual traditions or disciplines. So for example, children's needs can be looked at through an economic lens, which talks about child poverty. You could look at the same phenomenon through development studies lens or through sociological lens. You could look at it even through a theological lens. But you are all doing the masters in holistic child development, so the lens that you would look at your thematic would be through the lens of holistic child development. Once you have done that, and you've explored the academic conversations on the thematic, and you've related to the research problem that you've identified, so that the discussions still continue to represent, or at least still they are rooted to the deep concerns and problems you faced on the ground. But the academic conversation that talks about this research problem and the theme, it's called the discourse. So you're looking for a discourse on your thematic. And once you find that discourse, once you have identified it, you're going to look at its historical origins. When did they begin to talk about child poverty, for example? How did this discourse on child poverty develop over the period of time? So suppose, for example, and it's purely hypothetical, that child poverty first came into academic horizons in the 1970s. Then you're going to look and see who are the people who started to talk about it. How did the conversation move forward? How did they talk about it in the 80s, the 90s? And again, you don't have to follow a chronological sequence. Rather, you're going to see how the conversation developed over the last so many years of its existence. And this would form the research background in your script. This is the research background, the background story, the academic story of the conversation of your thematic. And once you've got that, you're going to look for the contemporary debate, maybe the last 3 to 5 years. What have academics been talking about your thematic? Debate means disagreement. Disagreement means that there is a space to go forward. There is a question implicit in a debate, an unanswered question. And if you are able to do it, you can convert a debate into your research question, so that when you answer it through your original research, you're actually able to move the academic discussion a step forward. And that's the excitement of doing research, because you do make a contribution to knowledge. So you go through the literature in terms of the discourse on the thematic, to identify the current debate and to articulate your research question. And doing this is the backbone of doing a critical literature review. This is pure academic work. So let me warn you, the next 2 weeks, you're not going to be looking at the research context, the organization, the stakeholders. You're going to be at your desk with your books in a library at home and by your laptop, and you're going to be reading and writing. The doing of the critical literature review is part of a larger cycle of research, which I've called the analytical cycle. The analytical cycle gives you 3 skills that enables you to do your critical literature review well. The 3 skills can be termed as analytical thinking, committed reading, and dialectical writing. And at the end of mastering these skills and applying them to your thematic, you would be more than ready to write up your critical literature review. So what I'm going to do in this session is very quickly go through these 3 skills and see how you could understand them and use them in doing your critical literature review. So let's begin with the first, analytical thinking. Analytical thinking is a powerful thinking tool. When we talked about the reflective cycle, we talked about reflective thinking. And now we're talking about analytical thinking. And it's a powerful tool for understanding a situation or text or a thematic by looking at its parts. Secondly, analytical thinking also helps us to compare and contrast different schools of thought on a particular subject or thematic. So analytical thinking has got 2 profound processes. The first one is to take a whole and divide it up into its parts. You analyze, you break it down. And secondly, you compare and contrast various points of view on it. So, analytical thinking is a deliberative process. It's not something that happens naturally. You don't wake up analyzing something. The naive position is to accept what's given to you. And then you say, wait a minute. You compare this with compare what they've said earlier, you contrast it and you say, there's something wrong here. Or you say, they're saying A, B, and C, and they're saying the sum of it is D, but it doesn't really hold up. There seems to be a gap. And when you're starting to do that, you're doing analytical thinking. First of all, the thematic, the subject of your inquiry must be established clearly. What are you going to do your analytical thinking about? So the main subject is then clearly thought about and broken into important subpoints. These are the different parts that constitute the whole, the subject or the thematic. So if your thematic is learning ability or acceptance of disability or child attendance or child slavery, then you need to break up your thematic into its constituent parts. So again, I've taken the example of the learning ability of children. So when you talk about the learning ability, and I'm speaking here as a non-specialist, I can immediately think of 4 constituent parts that go into the making of a child's learning. Number 1, the pedagogy used by the teacher. Number 2, the curriculum. Number 3, the child's learning processes. And number 4, the learning environment. So if learning has to happen for a child, without a curriculum, what is he going to learn? Without a teacher teaching, how is he going to learn? Without his own learning abilities or processes, whether it's kinesthetic or otherwise, how is he going to learn? And finally, there needs to be an environment in which he learns. I'm sure there are more factors. I'm sure there are more technical terms which I'm not aware of. But this is what I mean. Take a concept, an idea, a thematic, or even a text, and break it up into its constituent parts. You will then read and make notes on this broad thematic, for example, learning ability of children, as well as on the sub-thematics or these constituent parts that you have identified. So even as you read, you're collecting academic notes on the thematic and its constituent parts. Let me share a bit about how you collect these academic notes. So when you're reading something, I presume you're reading with either a notebook in your hand or your laptop open, and you're taking notes. Take the main points that you read, take an argument down, take a quote that you think is useful. But remember, always reference where you're taking down these notes. Reference clearly and carefully from where you got your material. Don't think that you'll come back to it and reference it. Often you will forget where you got what you got. There are different ways to do it. I take down notes on my laptop, and the way I do it is I create a file for every source. So I know that this file is on this particular article. So then I don't have to keep writing the name of the article to every quote and everything I've taken down. But then when I take down something, I just write the page number. So when you're doing final referencing, like I've already said, I require your footnotes to contain page numbers. There are some forms of referencing which doesn't require page numbers, but I do not advocate them, because how can the reader possibly follow up if there are no page numbers? So you must capture the page numbers. Now remember, if you're summarizing something, then summarize it and put still the page number. If you're capturing a complete quote, then put the quote marks in your notes so that later you don't mix between your summary and a quote. Both have to be referenced, but both are different kinds of note-taking. Anyhow, so you will take down notes on the thematic, on the constituent parts. And as you take down these notes, you are beginning to organize it into a debate with a view to identify the different schools of thought. So this is what you're looking for when you're reading. Okay, what does Smith say about child poverty? And now you're reading Fitzgerald and you're saying, is he saying something different? You're looking to see the difference so that you can pit Smith versus Fitzgerald. And that's a debate. What has Smith covered? What has he left out? What has Fitzgerald covered? What has he left out? What is comparably similar? What is there in contrast to both these accounts? What are the gaps in both their accounts? And maybe there are other authors like Roberts and McAllister who support what Smith says. And on the other hand, there are few other authors who support Fitzgerald. The moment you have identified these contrasting schools of thought, you've got something in your hand. Now you know how you could analyze and compare and contrast. Once you have identified these two schools of thought, then you can find out their claims, the evidences they supply, and the reasons they give in support of their positions. Now, you as a researcher, you are critically reading these positions. That's why it's called a critical literature review. And you are looking for holes in their reasoning, and you weigh their conclusions in terms of the evidences they supply, and you also are looking to see the debate that exists on the thematic. A debate means an unanswered question because there is still a debate on it, and therefore a good research question builds itself off an academic debate. If the debate had resolved itself, then obviously there is no question. So that's why identifying this debate is important, because you can turn the debate on its head and give yourself the research question, the academic research question. Okay, very quickly, in terms of doing a critical literature review, let me give the various steps of the process of analytical thinking. So you begin by thinking hard and deep on the thematic in order to break it into its components. Then, through your reading, you try and identify the different, hopefully contrasting, conflicting, but different schools of thought on the subject of your thematic. Thirdly, you show connections of comparison or contrast between these two opposing schools of thought. Fourthly, you examine the likeness and the differences in these two groups by comparing and contrasting the claims and evidences they supply, which are associated with each position. And finally, you allow this debate between these schools of thought to articulate for you the research question. Of course, analytical thinking is much broader than this in other domains of life, but when it comes to critical literature review, this is a good way of applying analytical thinking with regard to text. Now that's the first skill you're going to learn to do a critical literature review. The second skill is called committed reading. I cannot stress more the importance of committed reading. And let me be honest about this. Many of us from parts of the world where reading is not necessarily a part of our world. For maybe some of us it is. Maybe this current generation is all about MTV, it's all about what they watch on television and on YouTube, and it's very difficult to read a page. And some traditional societies do not have text as part of the home furniture. And so for us, reading does not come natural. And so we have learned to cope with reading requirements by scanning, skimming, and trying to represent what we read very quickly through scanning. But I cannot stress more the importance of committed reading. We really don't learn anything unless we are able to commit to and spend time wrestling with the text. If you have to represent anyone, you have to listen hard. And listening hard to an author is through committed reading. So I'm going to give you a few strategies, 6 in all, which every Harvard new undergrad student is given as part of their skills preparation when they join the school. Number 1, the first thing you do is called previewing. Don't read the text directly. Read around the text. So what you have to do is read about the author, read a review of the article or the book if you can find one, read how important the author is, his background, is he a giant in the field, look at how this text has been used by other academics in their writing, look at the back cover of the book to read what the book is meant to be about, look at the publishing house, the year of publication, look at the table of contents, and then read the introduction very carefully. If he's a good academic writer, then he's going to spend a good amount of time in describing clearly the central argument of the book and also its progression through the various chapters in the introduction. So a good introduction would tell you exactly what the book is about. Remember, this is not a mystery novel and you're not waiting to be surprised in the conclusion. This is hard reading. It's work reading. You need to know everything about the book before you begin reading it. So that's what is called previewing. And often in the process of previewing, you might decide not to read it. Or you might know exactly what you need to focus on while reading. Secondly, annotating. While you read, it's not a passive activity. I cannot think of reading a book today without a pencil in my hand. Or if it's real academic work, without a laptop document opened in front of me. You engage the text through underlining, through taking notes, and even as you read, in your mind will offer a commentary to what you read. Pay close attention to it. Because in that commentary, not only would you find your own critique of the text, you very much find the connections that your mind is making with this text and other texts. And also the gaps it's flagging. So listen to yourself as you read the text and note it down carefully. When you make connections with other things you've read, when you don't understand a word, don't skip it. Go look for its meaning so that you can completely grasp and comprehend the text. So annotation is very important. Taking notes. So don't blindly underline. If you're doing just blind underlining, at the end of the reading, you'll find you've underlined more than 90% of the text. And so there's nothing really useful about it. Or using a marker. On the other hand, take notes. Take down your commentary on the text. Number 3, outline, summarize, and analyze the text. So once you've read it, you've finished reading it completely, then in your own thinking, outline it. Summarize the main argument. And analyze it. Understand the argument put forward by the author. Maybe till now sometimes you've been reading for quotes to use. Now that's quite a fragmented form of reading. Now, at this level of work, you're going to read to be able to represent an academic. Number 4, you're going to look for repetitions and patterns. Very important. You're going to look for the things that the author is repeating, the kind of thinking the author is imbibed with, which the text reflects. And so you're looking for the patterns in his argumentative style, because all of this gives insight to what sort of text it is. Number 5, once you have understood the main contribution of the author, you contextualize it in the larger debate. Often the book itself, through its engagement with other academics, will reveal to which debate it is making a contribution, just like you are trying to enter into a debate. So you will know the historical debate with which this particular text you're reading is engaged with. And thus you get to know the other players, and maybe some of them are important for you. So even if you read one good article or book relevant to your thematic, that text will guide you and lead you into other texts and other authors who are writing on the same subject. And finally, after you have located this text, contextualized it in its debate, you compare and contrast this text with other texts. So these are few skills of committed reading. So in analyzing a text, you reflect upon and decide how effectively or poorly its argument has been made. Remember, you're not reading for facts and figures. You're not reading to find information. You're reading to find arguments. And you're reading to find how well they are made. An argument in a structure is basically a claim, an assertion an author makes, which is supported by premises, which are evidences. So that's an argument. An opinion is just what the author thinks, which is unsupported, and therefore we cannot value it. But a claim which is supported with evidence becomes an argument, and that is what we are looking for when we read academic text. So, how do we evaluate? Some of the questions we can ask as we read the text. What is the writer asserting? What am I being asked to believe? Is it a fact that is being put forward to me? Is it his opinion? Or is it an assertion that's backed up by evidence? What reasons or evidence does the author supply to convince me? Where is the strongest or most effective evidence the author offers? And why is it compelling? These are the questions that's in your mind even as you read these texts. So, committed reading of the key text will give you the structure of your literature review. If you do the committed reading on the thematic and its components, and you have traced the debate analytically, then in a sense you have looked at the various theories, various schools of thought, the various intellectual positions on your thematic, and you've covered it. You've seen the gaps, you've seen the pros and the cons of it. And now you need to begin writing. And the kind of writing that comes in this stage, I'm calling it dialectical writing. Dialectical writing is commonly required in academic writing to show relationships between pieces of information. Dialectical writing allows you more scope than descriptive writing or some form of narrative writing that you did previously, to show your voice, that is your interpretation of the source material. Your readers can detect your implicit voice because you have made the connections between these discrete pieces of information. You have created these schools of thought. You are pitting them one versus the other. You are the one who is comparing and contrasting. You have developed the main ideas under these different schools of thought. You have compared and contrasted the information, the claims and the conclusions and the evidences provided. You may also have sometimes implied a degree of judgment in using a limited range of evaluative language. We're not trying to evaluate yet. You're not trying to conclude. You're only representing the analysis. But somewhere you're able to say, oh, the limits of this school of thought is. So you've already hinted at how you form a judgment on it. However, this is a point to remember for this form of reading and writing. Your readers cannot and should not detect your explicit voice yet, because you have not clearly stated your position and developed arguments to support it. This is not argumentative writing. We'll come to that later on. You have not made explicit judgments about the material you are presenting. You have not tried to persuade your readers. You are still basically informing them about the debate. So remember this. In the analytical section, in your literature review, you are not picking sides. You are representing the debate. You are showing the gaps. But your voice is mostly implicit in how you structure it. And you are not explicitly making an argument. We will come to that towards the end of the project when you start doing argumentative writing. So quickly, the process of dialectical writing. Number one, you write out the thematic that needs to be analyzed, and you've done your background work for it. Then you break down the thematic to its various constituent parts, which becomes the various points of contention. Even as you read, you find out the different schools of thought on it. Number three, you carefully identify the claims and counterclaims made by these different authors on each of the points of contention and classify them predominantly into two schools of thought. Number four, note down the evidence given for both the claims and the counterclaims by these two schools of thought. 5, you summarize the two schools of thought in your own words so that you are able to represent them for these various points of contention. Number 6, you could even propose a name for these different schools of thought. Sometimes the literature itself will give you these schools of thought and their names. But sometimes, if you are kind of working with new literature and no one has done this mapping before, then you could actually say, this school, I would like to call it XYZ, and the other as ABCD. And finally, you're going to articulate a question worthy of research on the basis of this analysis. So this is dialectical writing. You've got 3 skills now. We talked about analytical thinking, committed reading, and dialectical writing. Now with that, let's now talk very specifically about the critical literature review, even as we come towards the end of this lecture. A literature review is a written document that presents a logically argued case founded on a comprehensive understanding of the current state of knowledge about a topic of study. A critical literature review as a review of secondary literature in order to set a conceptual and theoretical framework to your work. So the purpose is many. So I'm going to give you 3 purposes of why we do a critical literature review. Hopefully this will help us to understand its significance. Number 1, to demonstrate that you have a clear understanding of the depth and width of your topic, your thematic, and the academic debates involved, so that you're familiar with the existing literature in your area of investigation. This is absolutely important. If you're going to research on something, you need to know the subject. You need to know your thematic well. You need to know what others have written. Otherwise, when you start writing it in an academic setting or talking about it, you're going to very easily give yourself away as someone who is unaware of what's written before. Secondly, to identify gaps in literature so as to provide a rationale for your current study. Why are you even researching if the literature has already got its answers? Hopefully you're not researching a topic or bringing out a question that's already resolved 10 years back. So by doing this literature review, you're actually making sure that your question is a valid question, a legitimate research question worthy of being addressed and investigated. So the gaps may be any unanswered question, either methodologically or theoretically, that is of interest to you. Thirdly, to take a body of existing work further by enhancing its scope, or to replicate it in another context, or by varying the methodology. So you're basically taking the debate forward. You're basically taking the literature forward through your own research piece of work that you write in the end. So these are the various reasons why you do a critical literature review. And by doing it, you actually become part of that particular community of academics who have been working on that thematic. Imagine you enter a room and there are many tables, and in different tables there are groups of scholars sitting and they're discussing different thematics. You go to the table that talks about the thematic close to you, and you pull up a chair and sit down and you listen to what they are saying. You don't speak first. You may have a lot of questions, but you listen. And as you listen, you understand the conversation that's gone before you. You understand what they are saying, what they have said. And even as you get abreast of that conversation and become informed, you want to make a contribution. Maybe you begin with a statement, and after that, as they engage with you, you get more confident, and then you make an assertion, then you give your own evidences. They start listening to you, and you continue to do so, and then you feel your work is done, and you get up and leave, and the conversation continues. That's the world of the academics. That's the academic world. Welcome to it. Okay, when we talk about a critical literature review, there are 2 kinds. There's a simple literature review and a complex literature review. A written document that critically reviews the relevant literature on a research topic or thematic, presenting a logical case that establishes a thesis delineating what is currently known about the thematic. If the purpose of the inquiry is to argue a position about the current state of knowledge on a topic, then you're doing a simple literature review. So you're reviewing the literature and you're making an argument and you're showcasing what work has been done on the thematic until now. But a complex literature review is slightly different. The complex literature review extends the work of the simple review to identify and define an unanswered question requiring new primary research. And remember, you're going to do new primary research. So hopefully, you're going to look for this unanswered question in the literature, a gap in the literature. If the purpose of the inquiry is to review the literature to uncover a research problem, a question for further study, then you're doing a complex research literature review. A complex literature review is the process of reviewing literature on a thematic within disciplinary bounds with a view to map the debate on the thematic that would uncover a research problem that necessitates further research. The complex literature review is a starting point for research projects such as your own research project today. So even as we come to a close of this session, hopefully you have understood the need for a critical literature review. You have also understood the skills that are required, the skills of analytical thinking, committed reading, as well as dialectical writing, which are required to do a critical literature review. And hopefully you would imbibe these skills, you would apply them in your own reading and writing, and finally you'll be able to write out your critical literature review script. Good luck with your writing and your reading, and have a lovely 2 weeks of study.